a couple of weeks ago, as I was greeting you as you were leaving worship, someone came up to me and said, "Amy, when are we going to stop talking about sin? I don't like this." And I said, "Well, we only have three more sins to go. We conclude today." And I saved this one for last because, well, of the obvious reasons, lust is sometimes a hard thing to talk about in a worship setting. It can be, I think, one of the most complicated sins to understand and to grapple with for several different reasons. First of all, anytime we start talking about sex in church, it can just inherently make people feel uncomfortable. It just does. Second, many people don't think that their sexual lives have anything to do with their spiritual lives. And third, the idea of lust, the idea of desire is so enmeshed in our identities as people, as sexual beings. But just as we've discovered over these last weeks looking at the other 7 deadly sins, the sin of lust might not be just as cut and dry and as simple as we think it is. For a moment, let's look at how lust permeates our lives, but let's look at it from a different perspective. Let's look at it this way. Desire. The desire to have things. The desire is part of our human condition, and we were created with it. We were created with this urge to seek something beyond ourselves. The idea when God created us is that we were created with this desire to seek more of God, to seek God, and once we have God, to get more and more of God. But as we've learned over these last weeks, because of our sinful natures, we don't seek the things we were created to seek. We don't seek God. We seek other things. Some people seek money. Some people seek food. Some people seek sex to fill this hole that is in our lives that was created to only be filled with God. We seek things in lieu of that. So, because we were created to desire, because we were created in this manner, it's hard to try and suppress that. It's hard to try and change part of our identities, part of our core identities that we were created to be. So we were created with this urge, with this desire, and we were also created to be sexual beings. When we are in the situation where we are looking for a mate, or sometimes even when we aren't in that situation where we're looking for a mate, there are physiological things that are going on in our bodies. There's a rush of adrenaline when we meet someone that we are attracted to. Our bodies then start producing hormones and pheromones that are sent out to this other person that we are attracted to see whether that is accepted or rejected. We start producing those feel-good hormones like dopamine, which is that I'm in love feeling. We start producing serotonin, which is a balancing hormone. trying to get us back on an even keel. And we produce oxytocin, which is what unite people as a couple. These are the chemicals that make it feel so good when we're falling in love with people. When I'm counseling couples who are getting married, I call it the ooey gooey lovey-dovey phase, where I just want to be with you all the time, and we have that feeling that our lives just would cease to exist if we were not around that person. That's all of those chemical reactions, those physiological reactions that are going on in our body. And those things are supposed to happen. We are supposed to do all of those things, so we find a life partner that will journey through our days with us. We call it being attracted to another person. Now, there's different ways to become or to be attracted to other people. Sometimes it's a physical attraction. Sometimes it's an emotional attraction. Sometimes it's an educational or a mental attraction. But it doesn't matter what you are attracted to in a person, these same physiological changes occur within our bodies. But after all of the ooey gooey lovey-dovey phase of a relationship is over, there's another chemical that's produced, and it's called vasopressin. And that is a chemical that happens towards the end of the attraction cycle. And its job is to be a bonding agent. Its job is to make us stay with a person no matter what is going on. We've all had that experience where the ooey gooey love phase is over. And you look at a person that you're in a relationship with, and it's like, I don't even like you. Get out of my face. It's that vasopressin that keeps a couple united when those times in life happen. It's that vasopressin that is meant to turn this physical, attractional relationship into a mature and a committed relationship. So do you see why lust can be such a difficult sin to battle? We like those feelings of serotonin and dopamine and adrenaline. It gives us a rush. It makes us feel good. It's a physiological reaction that happens within us. And so lust is an even greater sin to battle. We aren't physically wired to commit envy. We aren't physically wired to become angry with people. We aren't physically wired to be prideful. But we are physically wired in some ways for lust. I can work on becoming less angry. I can work on not being prideful. It's very hard to change my physiological makeup to battle lust. So with these ideas in mind, let's start with the obvious definition of lust. Desiring someone in a sexual way, and an inordinate craving for the pleasures of the body, for physical pleasures. And one of the most famous, or even probably more infamous, examples of the consequences of the sin of lust is the story of David and Bathsheba. It's found in 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and they besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David rose from his couch and was walking about on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful. David sent someone to inquire about the woman, and it was reported that this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So David sent messengers to get her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she was purifying herself after her period. That's why she was bathing. Then she returned to her house. The woman conceived, and she sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So David sent word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab and the people fared and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." Uriah went out of the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the entrance of the king's house with all of the servants of his lord, and did not go down to his house. When they told David, Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, "You have just come from a journey. Why did you not go down to your house?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah remain in booths, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in an open field. Shall I then go to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will do no such thing." Uriah didn't want to go home and experience the comforts of home while his comrades were laying in an open field. He made an honorable choice here. Then David said to Uriah, "Remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. On the next day, David invited him to eat and drink in his presence and made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on his couch with the servants of his lord, but he did not go down to his house. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him, so that he may be struck down and die." As Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant warriors. The men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite was killed as well. Wow, there's a lot to unpack in that story. Oftentimes when we hear this story, we think of the sin of adultery. Well, yes, David was married. He was married to Michal, who was the daughter of his predecessor, King Saul. We know about Michal. There might have been other wives. During that time, it was common for the kings to have plural marriages, and so there might have been any number of wives that David had at that time. So I don't think the story is so much about infidelity, at least on David's part, although it is certainly a big part of the story. This is an example, pure and simple, of the sin of lust. He sees Bathsheba bathing, and those chemicals start being produced. That physiological reaction happens, and he is a man who has a great amount of power, and takes advantage of the situation. Now, the sin of lust, especially in this example, is a very secretive sin. It's a very secretive sin, And it wasn't just one thing that David did. If he had had sexual relations with Bathsheba, a married woman, and him as a married man, just because of his desire to have his lust satiated, that would have been bad enough. But it was so much worse than that. First, he tried to make it look like Uriah was the father. He impregnates Bathsheba, and in that attempt to cover up what he'd done, the first thing that came to mind is, well, okay, I'll get her husband home, he'll go home, they'll have sex, she's pregnant, it will look like he's the father. But that didn't work. Uriah did not follow the plan. That might be false witness, trying to get a man to think that his wife's child was his even though it wasn't. There's the sin of false witness. When that plan didn't work, David invites Uriah to his house, has a party, gets him drunk, think he'll go home, and they can get this plan A back on track. That didn't work either. And so finally, he orders Uriah sent to the front lines while the rest of the troops withdraw, ensuring that he would be killed. That is murder. That is murder. So not only is one sin committed, many more sins are committed in trying to cover up the original one. Now, those are the simple things, the obvious things to walk away with the story from. But there are several more aspects for us to be aware of that maybe aren't quite so obvious. I mentioned earlier that a lot of people don't believe that their sexual lives have anything to do with their spiritual lives, and that isn't the case. The gift of intimacy that we experience in our sexual lives is a gift from God. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we're told the creation story. We're told that God created living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, the birds of the field, the wild animals of every kind, and then God created humankind. Now, Adam was created first. Adam was the first of humankind to be created, and he goes about naming all of the animals, and as he's going through, he and God realize that there is not a suitable person to be a companion to Adam. I know some folks would argue that a dog comes really close, but there's not a companion suitable for Adam. And so God caused Adam to fall into a deep sleep, and he took a rib from Adam and used it to create Eve. And so when Adam awoke and saw Eve for the first time, he said, "This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken." And then Genesis 2:24 goes and says this, "Therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." So we have Adam, who was created in God's image. God has intimate knowledge of Adam. There is not a single thing about Adam that God does not know. And then God takes a piece of Adam and creates another being, also created not only in God's image, but also in Adam's image. God knew woman inside and out, just like he knew man. But a piece of Adam being in Eve also provided the opportunity for Adam to know Eve inside and out as well. And the gift of sex was provided as a means to make that happen. We hear terms that say they became one flesh, or he knew his wife. We read those in the Bible. That's not some kind of secret code for the two people had sex. It's a way of knowing people in an intimate way, knowing another person in a very intimate capacity. I would challenge us to find another behavior or action that enables us to know somebody in a more personal and a more intimate way than having intimate relations with them. The idea of two people coming together in this way is one of the last means of self-transcendence. And what I mean by that is that two individuals put aside their own agendas and come together as one and becoming part of something that is greater than either one of them. This happens to us physically, but it also happens in a very mysterious way. The act of sex is a part of an overall process, just a piece of it, though. But part of this process that takes a you and a me and makes an us. Now, when we don't embrace that mysterious aspect and only focus on the physical part, that's where the door for lust is opened. When we practice this gift of our sexuality as it was intended by God, it helps us gain an inside and out knowledge of our partner. There's not a single person in this world that I know better than my husband. This would be so much more fun if he were actually here to hear this. There is not a person that I know better than my husband. Now, that does not mean that there are times when I look at him and go, really? Seriously? I mean, come on. But I have an intimate knowledge of this man, not just in a sexual way, but an intimate knowledge. When we go to a certain restaurant, I know what he's going to order to drink. I know what he's going to order to eat. I know what really makes him mad. I know what brings him the most joy. I know him. That's the kind of self-transcendence that I'm talking about. It's no longer a you and a me. It's an us. There's another way that we can experience this self-transcendence, this idea of being caught up in something greater than ourselves, and that's in our relationship with God. A sexual experience is only temporary. It's a moment in time. Our God experience is one that should be filling every moment of every day. And when we fall into the temptation of lust and misuse the gift of sex, we're trying to replace a God experience with a temporary experience. And anytime something becomes a wedge in our relationship with God, that is a sin. Anytime that we make something more important in our lives than God, that is a sin. God knows me as intimately as my husband does. God knows Todd as intimately as I do. But God also wants us to know God as intimately as we know each other. The intimate act of sex with a loving partner helps us to know God more and to know God better. We are using a gift that is not meant only as a physical, but meant as a mysterious way to understand a relationship that we have with God. And that's why our sex lives have everything to do with our spiritual lives, and why we have to be very careful with the sin of lust. Just like my husband would have a problem if I went lusting after other men, God has a problem with us lusting after things to replace him. Things like the god of money, the god of power, the god of things, the god of prestige. That's why it's so important that we look out for the sin of lust. Now, there's another aspect of lust that I'd like to examine today that isn't quite as obvious, and that's the idea of objectifying another person. It's author John Green that's credited with the quote, "People were created to be loved. Things were created to be used. The reason why this world is in chaos is because things are being loved and people are being used." When we give in to this temptation of lust, when we view someone as a thing of desire rather than a child of God, we are objectifying them. Chris Reisner and I spent several days at the Church of Resurrection's Leadership Institute this past week. I'll share a little bit more on that at the end of the service. But as part of the workshop, we were shown a video that was created by the North Carolina Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church, and in it, male clergy were asked to read statements that had been made to their female colleagues. Now, they didn't know ahead of time what they were going to be reading. They were just told, show up and we'll have your script available for you. Here are a couple of the comments that these male colleagues read that had been actually said to female pastors that pertain to our topic today. "I can't concentrate on your sermon because you're so pretty. You have to laugh because if not, you might be tempted to do another one of the deadly sins. It's funny, but it's not so funny. I keep picturing you naked under your robe. During Holy Communion, it's hard for me to concentrate when you say, 'This is my body given for you,' because I keep thinking about your body instead of Jesus's. If I were 20 years younger, you wouldn't be able to keep me away from you." Now, I'm not sharing these statements with you to highlight the plight of female clergy, although I will tell you it is an experience that most female clergy have had. If you want to know more, talk to me later. I'm sharing them because these are examples of objectification. The people making these comments to their pastor were not seeing their pastor as their spiritual leader or a shepherd or even a fellow child of God. They were seeing their pastor in a physical manner only, one that got all of those hormones and pheromones raging, but that is about it. The objectification of people is a huge problem today because it's a huge industry. According to some research that I did, in 2018, the pornography industry's net worth was between $6 billion to $15 billion. And who knows if that's right, because a lot of these companies are privatized and they don't report accurately. It's estimated that there are between 20 to 40 million people that are slaves of some kind due to human trafficking. 50,000 people are trafficked into the United States annually each year, and the profits from human trafficking are 150 billion. 99 billion of that is from sexual exploitation. These are just a couple of the results that come from objectifying people and seeing them only as a thing to satisfy personal desires and agendas. Throughout the story I read earlier of David, he continues to treat people like objects. His treatment of Bathsheba and Uriah is a warning to us. Instead of respecting Bathsheba as a woman and a wife, David sees her as an attractive thing designed to give him pleasure. And instead of honoring Uriah as a soldier and her husband, David just disposes of him as though he were an annoying throwaway object. This story shows the great harm that can be done when we treat people as objects instead of, well, people, and especially children of God. It's not just physical lust that causes us problems. In our lust for our own desires, we can objectify other people, treating them as a stepping stone to get what we want. We befriend someone because they can help us accomplish something. We form relationships based on what people can give to us, how they can help us. Treating people and objectifying them isn't just done in a sexual way. It's not limited to the world of sexual misconduct. It can happen anywhere, and it can happen anytime. So even though the sin of lust might not be quite as simple as we think, luckily, the way to combat it is, it's very simple. Love people, use things. People aren't things. See people, see everyone as the precious child of God that they are, made in the image of God. Respect them as daughters and wives and sons and husbands and mothers and fathers, faithful fellow Christians, faithful human beings. Love them as Christ loves them. And when we begin to see everyone through the eyes of Christ, it becomes so much harder to see them as an object. It becomes so much harder to see them in any way other than a beloved child of God. This way, we begin to see others as God sees them. The way to do that is to gain a more intimate knowledge of God, to have our hearts transformed into the hearts of God, and to have our eyes transformed into the eyes of Christ. The way that we start seeing people as God sees them is to become more God-like, to become more Christ-like. But like I said, we're physiologically wired for lust. We're physiologically wired for desire. So if we are going to lust, here's some good ways to do it. Let us lust to find ways to please God. Let us be lustful in our attempt to glorify God. Let us desire Christ so that we may become more intimately in love with Jesus. That seems a much better use of this sin, doesn't it? Amen.